Welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to talk about how we migrated a large-scale BizTalk application to Azure. Now, if you're a technology decision maker, particularly if you're running an estate with BizTalk in it and you know you need to move that, or if you're an integration developer or any other kind of developer or technology implementer, or if you're involved in operations supporting BizTalk, then this is probably for you. I have with me today David Robinson, who is a solution architect in 345 Technology with vast experience of both Azure and BizTalk. And obviously, you know me, I'm Andrew Rivers. I'm the founder and CEO of 345 Technology. So, let's kick off then, get straight into it. So, Dave, let's just talk about, the project we're going to talk about. Let's just talk about it as a whole in terms of what was the environment like? How many servers or groups were involved? How complex was it? Let's just have a bit of a flavour of that to start with.
So this was probably one of the most complicated BizTalk environments I've seen in quite a long time, to be honest. I think it was slightly over-engineered, but it consisted of roughly 5 BizTalk groups. So there's one central BizTalk group, almost like a routing hub as such. And then each of the individual towers in the customer had their own groups. So for example, sales, ERP systems, or back-end order processing systems and so on. So each of those towers within the business had their own BizTalk group. And they originally done that to help try and segregate in terms of performance and functionality and so on, because they thought that was the way they needed to do it.
So it's almost like they've taken the integration hub thing almost to extreme.
Yes, exactly.
But it also meant that each of those towers could act as a store and forward before it actually went into the essential ones.
Yeah, indeed. But if you look at the architecture, you could probably have simplified that by using content-based routing anyway, really, because that's effectively all this central group was doing store and forward. So it was just another hop in the whole end-to-end process, really.
And we'll get onto this a bit later, but what that probably meant was that they'll probably pay more for it than they need to.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So what were the real drivers for doing a migration from BizTalk into Azure?
So this particular customer, they had an issue with their BizTalk licenses, and they were also concerned about end-of-life support for BizTalk, which, as we all know, is coming up. But it was mainly about not wanting to renew their BizTalk licenses, but the side issue being the extended support that they didn't want to go into as well.
So actually the business case was based on license costs and not necessarily on the fact that they were out of support.
Yeah, although they would have had to address the same issue in a couple of years anyway.
It's going to happen. I mean, just for those of you that don't know, I mean, even the latest version of BizTalk is out of mainstream support in 2028.
Yeah.
But even if you've got BizTalk now and you look at the next 5 years, look at the license costs, because you'd be in support, but just look at the overall cost of ownership. Yeah. And what about the actual, who'd written that solution, who was still supporting it?
So in terms of who'd written the solution, it was developed quite a number of years ago, over 10 years ago, and it had been developed originally by a supplier that had since moved on. But of course the support team that had picked up the solution and developed enhancements and so on didn't really have the original understanding of why it was designed that way, why it was implemented that way and so on. So they kind of bolted on, and it almost became a little bit like a stick and plaster implementation and solution, really. Yeah,
because if you don't understand what the patterns are, and then you just kind of hack that about a bit, then you're not necessarily going to do it in the right way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the different BizTalk groups, but in terms of the sort of the complexity and the interfaces, is there anything sort of we can elaborate on that, just so that people kind of the people listening get a better feel for what that might have looked like technically?
So technically there was, for the various different towers that they had, there was quite a lot of complex orchestrations, doing quite a lot of specific business logic that we obviously don't need to go into detail, but each customer has different business logic, but it was quite complex business logic in some of the orchestrations. There was a lot of use of pipeline components, uncompressing files and so on, so there was a lot of large volumes of messages, and they were zipped up, so there was a lot of decompression and things like that. So there was quite a lot of pipeline components needed, but primarily because there was 40 or so different interfaces. There was a lot of different message formats for all of the different interfaces. So lots of schemas, lots of maps, and oftentimes within the solution where they were migrating from one version of an external schema to another, for example 1.2 to 1.3 of a particular message format, rather than go back and change the original messages, they were adding on another map that would map from 1.2 to 1.3, and there was quite a large amount of these sorts of scenarios whereby they were just bolting on, bolting on, bolting on. So going back to the sticking plaster comment, there was quite a lot of BizTalk maps to do that logic. If you look back on this now and you were to simplify it, you would of course...
You said you don't need that.
Yeah, you don't need that, and you change your original canonical message in such a way to deal with those scenarios and map from canonical to destination and so on. There was quite a lot of flat file schemas, so again, the usual sort of BizTalk environment, file drops, flat files and so on. So, and also this was one of the concerns at the time when the project started, there was a large use of the BizTalk rules engine. So it turns out that wasn't as complex as it sounded, but there was a lot of BizTalk rules within there, so that was an area of complexity, really.
Yeah, because the rules engine gets used and abused a lot, because it's one of the things that you can change without redeploying the application. So people often use it for configuration, and you often use it for sort of routing rules and that sort of thing, as opposed to it just being pure business rules. So it kind of gets used for all sorts of stuff.
So the two main things they used it for was the routing, so the sorts of things you could do content-based routing on a filter, on a SEM port, for example. But also, from a business perspective, they wanted to capture when data had been sent to a system and when it hadn't been sent to a system. So they had these complex business rules whereby they were saying, if this message is not this, set, not sent. So they were tracking what had been sent and what had not been sent by these complex BizTalk rules engine rules.
Okay, so you know, customer knows they need to migrate. They've got a business case based on the license costs, and we've then got this solution. It's not ideal, but it's kind of working. It's not ideal. So how did you then go about? You know, what was the thought process to sort of get this thing underway? In terms of, you know, you've taken on as the technical lead, you've taken on this project. I mean, what was the thought process going through to sort of get a grip on the project?
So I think the first part of this was understanding, at the time when the project started, a couple of years ago, not all of the features of BizTalk were in place within Azure Integration Services. We knew that you could reuse schemas, you could reuse maps, only certain amounts of maps, but also we knew that you couldn't reuse the BizTalk rules engine. So one of the first things we had to do was identify really how they were using those features in BizTalk and understand, could we use any of the features of Azure Integration Services. So we identified different types of maps, high complexity, low complexity, some that would execute in logic apps, some that wouldn't. But more importantly, the rules engine was the real area of concern initially, because there's no equivalent rules engine at the time.
Yeah, and of course the product team is lifting and shifting the rules engine into Azure. I think it's still in preview.
Yeah, it's still in preview. Yeah.
But they are trying to migrate more and more of these features, so that there is feature parity with BizTalk. And I think they're also supporting the more complex maps now as well, where you actually call out to
I'll come on to that later on, because we got to a point with the maps where we could reuse some of the new features.
And so, so we're looking at this thing. We're trying to understand how that routing works, all that sort of stuff. Understand what we can do, what we can't do, and then presumably just looking at what do those interfaces look like? What does the interaction with those external systems look like?
So in terms of understanding the interfaces, we had to define the high priority interfaces, because remember I talked about different BizTalk groups. Some of the interfaces primarily lived on one of the BizTalk groups, and they were probably the key interfaces within the business, within the organisation in terms of message flow. So we looked at the different interfaces, understood how they were split across the different BizTalk groups, because if we could replace all of the interfaces on one BizTalk group as part of the first tranche of changes, then that BizTalk group could be turned off and so on.
Yeah, so you don't have to wait till the end of the project to actually get some value of, of cost saving.
So it was about prioritising the interfaces in such a way you could deliver regularly, but also be able to regularly switch off the BizTalk environment.
Yeah, so like deliver, it's like the whole agile thing, isn't
Yeah,
it?
exactly.
Of constantly delivering
Yeah.
value.
Yeah.
And in terms of Azure as a platform, I mean, obviously you know you're going from BizTalk, you've kind of got to put in an Azure platform, but then that's still got to talk to all those other things. So what was your approach to sort of thinking about for Azure, first of all from an infrastructure, and then from a kind of how you implement the right patterns on top of that?
So from an infrastructure perspective, the features of BizTalk, obviously PubSub is the big part of BizTalk.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to re-implement the PubSub, so we used service bus topics and subscriptions, and that was the backbone of the solution effectively.
Yeah, because in BizTalk obviously you've got the message box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so everything has to publish to the message box, and then everything has to subscribe from it. So PubSub, with BizTalk, it's almost like you've got to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
It won't let you not do PubSub, whereas with Azure you do have the choice, but it's still a good pattern to do because it fundamentally decouples.
Yeah.
It decouples you receive from your sensor.
So the Service Bus, and particularly Service Bus Premium, because at the time Service Bus Premium was the only version that supported topics and subscriptions. Service Bus Premium was a key part of the solution, really.
Yeah, and topics helps you segregate those different workloads and filter them, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like you've got with a BizTalk environment where you've got multiple send ports subscribing to the same message, we would create multiple subscriptions for the different destination systems and replicate effectively receive ports, send ports, with messages being sent to Service Bus and then the subscribers for a topic, picking them up.
Yeah, because in the Azure sort of world, you're not as bound to things as rigidly as with BizTalk, but actually logically to sort of map, for example, a logic app as a receive port, and maybe a logic app as a send port, kind of at least it lets you use that pattern, even though it's actually the same technology doing each of those things.
The whole BizTalk pattern maps quite nicely onto Azure, really, into Azure integration services, and that's no surprise really, considering the product teams are obviously have a background in BizTalk themselves anyway. Yeah,
and so in terms of how you actually then went through, so we've got the core infrastructure. Did you use functions as well as logic apps?
So we use functions and logic apps.
With service bus in the middle.
Service bus in the middle,
as the broker.
So imagine if, for example, you had an ESB pattern where you've got a source system, and you might have a messaging only solution, or if you've got a destination system that was messaging only. Often in the BizTalk environment, you don't always have BizTalk orchestrations, but in most cases, in the customer, they did have BizTalk orchestrations, but there's no equivalent of receive ports, send ports. So we would have a message received from the system and processed by a logic app, sent to Service Bus, and then a message picked up from Service Bus via one of the subscriptions and processed via a logic app and sent to whatever the destination system was. The function apps we used to a certain extent, whereby we needed to do things like pipeline components.
Yeah.
So again, you've got no pipeline components in Azure as of yet.
But if you want to actually go out to code to do stuff, then functions are where that it lends itself to that.
So if, for example, you had your logic app that was receiving a message, the equivalent of executing the pipeline component would be, one of the first steps in the logic app would be call a function that's doing the equivalent of the code from the pipeline component. And the code pretty much worked, picking it up and re-implementing it in a function pretty easily, to be honest. There was not a lot of change other than the signatures of the function apps and so on.
Yeah.
But the actual fundamental code was pretty straightforward to lift and shift into function apps.
Because that's one of the things that's really powerful about migrating from BizTalk to Azure, is that it is the only option that allows reuse, really. Yeah. And like I say, you've got that amount of code reuse. It still needs a bit of effort to take the core of that out and put it through. You already talked about reusing schemas and reusing maps. And then in the future you'll be able to reuse the rules engine as well. So a massive amount of reuse that is not available in any other integration platform you migrate to. That level of reuse doesn't exist, and hence you will have to spend more to get to the same place.
So with the maps, you mentioned the maps then, with the maps, we actually looked at those and categorised them as low complexity maps and high complexity maps. And low complexity were the usual ones using the out-of-the-box functoid that would produce quite a straightforward XSLT.
Yeah.
But then you've got more complex ones that are using external assemblies or inline C#, and at the time, they weren't supported. So
when you segregated those out, that's because you knew you could reuse the low complexity ones, but you thought you might have had to re-implement the high complexity ones.
But in the end, the high complexity ones, we created a mapping function that would effectively implement XSLT transform and take the equivalent of what you might do in BizTalk via a sendport or directly within a logic app. So where you've got the XSLT transform shape, rather than call that for the complex map, we would just call the function instead.
Yeah.
But later on, when the product team rolled out the support for the advanced maps, the inline C# and the assemblies and so on, we replaced that function with just the standard transformation.
Because then that simplifies the whole thing,
exactly,
doesn't it? And a bit like you said with the BizTalk thing, it had sticking plasters on, which actually made it increasingly complex.
Yeah.
It's always good to maintain solutions so that they are as simple as they can possibly be. So even though you could have left things like they were, but actually leveraging the features of the platform meant that you ended up with a simpler and hence more maintainable solution.
And the customer was pretty good in understanding technical debt in things such as we had this function that we originally used, but they understood that there was some features coming further down the line. So we had technical debt to track things like that, to say we wanted to be able to convert, to use the latest existing XSLT transform shapes and so on. So we actually did revisit that, as mentioned, later on in the program.
Let's talk about orchestrations.
Yeah.
Because obviously in BizTalk, orchestrations are the process logic.
Yeah.
So how easy was it to migrate that into logic apps?
So this was probably the hardest part from the perspective. You can't just lift and shift an orchestration and copy it directly into a logic app. The key part here was the upfront design, or not necessarily the design, but understanding the design and creating an equivalent logic app design document, for example, for a particular interface. If the orchestration was quite complex, because there wasn't a lot of documentation or a lot of understanding of the orchestration that was there was an onus on us, myself, to understand that design and create a new design that you could then implement in the logic app, looking at the orchestration, seeing what it done, seeing what patterns it implemented and so on. So that was probably where there was the most complexity in understanding what had been done. But that wasn't necessarily a problem of the orchestrations or going to Azure. That was just the business logic that the customer had implemented.
Yeah, because I mean, on the face of it, orchestrations have a visual designer that makes it look like a flowchart, and logic apps have a visual designer that's a bit like a flowchart, but there is actually very little direct technical overlap between them.
Yeah. But when you looked at the business process and looked at the orchestration, if you understood orchestrations and looked at the logic app and understood, you could kind of see a correlation. But again, unless you were from a BizTalk or Azure background, you wouldn't necessarily associate the two things. But if you had that experience, you would know what to look for and how to re-implement that as a logic app as such.
And just to actually go from that down that route for a second. So you're highly skilled in BizTalk and in Azure.
Yeah.
If you're going to do this type of migration, if you didn't have one or other of those, how much of a challenge would it be? I mean, what sort of level of what are the skills needed to do this type of project?
I think the skills needed are more so understanding integration patterns, understanding what an integration looks like, but also understanding BizTalk to be able to create a new design that you might implement in a logic app. Because as part of the team that worked on the program, whilst I was doing the designs and taking the BizTalk designs and re-implementing them in such a way that other team members could pick up, some of the team members were new to Azure, new to logic apps, but the key was the understanding of BizTalk and understanding the patterns and understanding how an orchestration worked to be able to simplify the design or re-implement the design in a direct one-to-one mapping with logic apps as such. So I think the key thing here is the BizTalk knowledge, but on top of that, from the years of experience we've all got at BizTalk, is the integration skills really. that's kind of what's more important than the technology as such, understanding what the integration patterns are, what they're trying to achieve, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's obviously 345 Technology is a specialist integration consultancy, but it's no coincidence that many of our guys have got BizTalk background, because it teaches all the right things.
Yeah.
So we talked about orchestrations. We talked a bit about rules engine, and so you sort of said a bit about the rules engine, understanding that. But how was that? Because you couldn't directly use rules engine in Azure, and theoretically you still can't because it's in preview.
Yeah.
What was the type of how was that migrated then?
So that was migrated by, as we picked up each interface and doing the design for each interface, we looked at obviously the end-to-end process flow, the orchestrations and the maps and schemas, but we also looked what it was doing with the BizTalk rules engine and the policies and so on, and the vocabularies as part of that policy. And pretty much most of them were all about routing.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at, well, what's it trying to do here? It's trying to make sure a certain system picks up a message by setting a custom properties and so on. So we pretty much implement most of that functionality in Service Bus topic subscriptions with custom filters. Some of them were quite complex, and obviously where you've got a source system pushing a message onto Service Bus, you had to make sure it would evaluate that condition and add that as a property to the Service Bus. But a lot of that was implemented as topic and subscription filters. So all of the routing was controlled via that, and therefore you've got the equivalent of what they were implementing or what they were doing with the business rules engine.
But just using the features in the platform
exactly.
to actually achieve that.
Yeah.
And so in terms of kind of development then, how did you find the difference in development environment, and also what was the difference in terms of things like DevOps and deployment and that kind of thing?
Well, from a development perspective, having years of experience of Azure as well and doing Logic Apps, and particularly Logic Apps consumption, where people would often develop in the portal.
Mm-hmm.
This was a project all about using Logic Apps standards, so we were very keen on at the start of the program to say, we're not going to develop in the portal, we're going to ensure we have proper development processes, proper DevOps processes. So we obviously set up VS Code to be able to develop Logic Apps locally, with all the extensions you need and so on, and all of the different add-ins you need for that. So every developer used VS Code and had all the extensions, and every developer ran the Logic Apps locally within reason, where there's certain things you can't do when running them locally, but the majority of the development was done locally, or the Logic App was written locally and then deployed. We obviously had CI/CD pipelines to package up the Logic Apps and the bicep scripts to create all of the infrastructure and so on. So we were very much focused on fully automated processes, because again, some of the existing platform over the years, things have been deployed manually, which often happens under times of stress and so on. But it was a case of...
BizTalk's quite a hard thing to do DevOps for anyway.
Yeah.
So if you haven't got, you need quite a deep amount of DevOps knowledge to actually do DevOps on BizTalk properly.
Yeah.
And so we come across it quite a lot.
Yeah.
That hasn't been done.
Yeah.
And so, but having said that, you're leaving that old world behind and going to a new world. What you might as well do in the new world is do everything properly.
Yeah. But one of the customer's key guiding principles as well was that they had a team that were less experienced, and there was the sheer volume of interfaces meant that we couldn't do it all, but we had to have a process in place, where a proper development process that they could follow, a proper check-in process, PRs and so on, and then the full DevOps cycle to deploy, because again, where you've got less experienced team members, you want to simplify it as much as possible for them as well, so they can focus on writing the code and not have to worry about how am I going to deploy this and so on.
And just by having those sort of guardrails in place means that it's all about making it easy to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. If you can take away as much of the day-to-day automation sort of tasks, and that's what DevOps is all about, really, automating things. If you can take away that from the developer, and they can focus on, here's the design for a new Logic App, implement that, follow the existing process for checking the code in, deploying to a given environment and so on, then that just means they can focus on the core business logic, really.
And so we've got all that developed, and then you kind of get into sort of production readiness and that sort of thing. So, how did you do things like planning for performance and capacity planning,
Yeah.
making sure that some particularly highly stressed parts of this platform didn't bleed through and affect other ones?
Yeah. So the original design of the BizTalk infrastructure, whereby they had separate towers, that kind of masked a lot of that because it was so overpowered for what was needed. It kind of masked a lot of that. But again, reasons for that at the time, obviously hardware costs and so on. You might overpower things anyway or overspec things. From BizTalk, from an Azure perspective, you want to obviously make your Azure costs as cheap as possible. So you could have replicated that directly and had one app service plan per tower. You could have multiple app service plans per tower and lots of instances of those. But again, you might be overspeccing your Azure infrastructure. So we tried to.
But the good thing about that, though, really, is that with cloud, as long as you're on top of this stuff, it's easy to change that later.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy to make things more or less powerful as you understand the workloads. Whereas when you're actually buying physical tin for an on-premises solution, you're kind of locked in for the whole life cycle of that. So you've got this tendency to, I want to overspec this now because I've got to buy all the tin now, and then I don't really get another chance. Whereas with cloud, you can.
We were really keen to make sure up front to understand the interfaces, understand the performance of the interfaces, and put them into app service plans in such a way that high performance, high throughput ones would live on their own, or a set of interfaces with low throughput requirements, they could all coexist together. So if there was noisy neighbours, then there wouldn't be so noisy, sort of thing. So we spent a lot of time understanding the performance metrics or the non-functional requirements to understand what interfaces could sit together if needs be, because whilst as you say you can change those and you can put things on other app service plans, we wanted to get as many upfront savings, operational savings costs as possible by doing things right in the first place, because we had the time and we had the ability to do it in terms of implementing the BizTalk migration to Azure. We wanted to do things right at the beginning to show the cost savings as well, because that was key to this, to be able to show the cost savings to the higher echelons.
Because ultimately that's the success criteria of the project.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're still in BizTalk land and you're talking about app service plans, it's almost like an app service plan is the equivalent of a host.
Yeah.
And similarly, like you might have some hosts that are tuned for low latency and some that are tuned for throughput.
Yeah.
It's a very similar thing that you can do the same thing with app service plans that you can. So just as a very first cut, that's the way I think of it, is that you can have a plan rather than a host, and then you can put multiple logic apps on the plan, like the way you can put multiple orchestrations on a host. There's so many equivalents, so many parallels. What about sort of networks and security? I mean, how did that all fit together?
So there were existing on-premises systems that we needed to communicate with. So the logic apps, we needed to make sure we set up a VNet in such a way that the logic apps had private endpoints that could communicate with the on-premises networking and so on. So there was a whole design piece where we contributed to, but it was under the ownership of an infrastructure team, but it was very much about setting up VNets and VNet peering between.
And it's like the whole, like the landing zone and the VNet peering,
exactly.
And then being able to plug into that landing zone model so that you can have like almost like your integration part just fitting in with the rest of the platform landing zone.
Exactly. So there was a lot of effort up front to do that as well, to see, well, what interfaces have we got that need to communicate with on premises, and obviously define the network in such a way that that could happen.
And the other thing which is actually really, really important is the operational, the monitoring and support side of things.
Yeah.
So how, was there anything that you could lift directly, or was that more just a question of leveraging the new Azure platform and implementing that differently? So what were the sort of key lessons from the monitoring and operational side?
Well, the monitoring, two parts to the monitoring. There's the platform monitoring, so we utilise a lot of the application insights login and log analytics to understand performance metrics of individual interfaces and so on. So, but also the business had a requirement to be able to want to track a particular item that would go from system A to system B. So you could do that through application insights logs. You could create dashboards, but not necessarily end user friendly as such.
Yeah, because they're not necessarily made for that.
No.
But they're really, all the app insights and dashboards are really good,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily made for that
Yeah.
specific thing. So how did you go about solving that one?
So effectively, what we were trying to do there was the equivalent of BizTalk that you call BAM, so
Mhm.
business activity monitoring. So we looked at how can you do business activity monitoring in AIS at the time, and I know they're working on this now, and there's great features in Logic Apps now in terms of being able to monitor things proactively
Yeah,
at a higher level than what the application insights gives you.
because the equivalent to BAM in Azure now is business activity tracking.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, is that still in preview or is that released now?
I think it's released now, isn't
Yeah,
it?
but at the time that feature wasn't available,
It was not available.
and so you had to look at other things. So which route did you go down in the end?
So we looked at Turbo 360, or as it was called at the time, Serverless 360.
Mm-hmm.
And I've come across those before from a BizTalk background using BizTalk 360.
Yeah,
So I kind of knew of their product set and what they'd done for Azure, and I knew that they had this business activity monitoring component. So we looked at what was needed and we implemented their module, and we tracked a lot of the key business functionality using their business activity monitoring, using their Azure dashboard or their customer facing portal to give that ability to a customer to look to see what's happened from interface A to interface B, end to end and so on. So we took the whole thing of it being more of a third line support thing to a more first line support or a business user where they could log on, just look at the key information they want to look for and get that nice visual view of what had happened.
that's good. And so if you're interested in that kind of BAM for Azure, and Turbo 360 is a great product. Get in touch with us. We can help you put that in, because we've done that. We've done that loads of times now. So do talk to us about that if that's something of interest.
And also even the business activity monitoring Turbo 360 that was around 2 years ago that we used, they've made enhancements and changes to that to make it easier to use that as well now. So there's two options for doing business activity monitoring.
Yeah, so it's kind of a strong product set in that area now.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're getting close to the end of this now. So what would you say kind of the key, the really key takeaways are from what we talked about so far?
I think the key takeaway for a large migration project like this was understanding the existing designs, and where you don't necessarily always have, for an old solution, you don't always have detailed documentation, or the documentation has never been updated because things evolve. Key was understanding the design, and that experience of working on a BizTalk solution and working on an integration project was key, really. We kind of knew, or I kind of knew, that the technology, you could figure out a way of making it work. But the key was understanding the design.
Technology always behaves itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's understanding what it needs to do, isn't it?
Yeah, the technology. I always say the technology is the easy bit.
Yeah.
It's the actual.
It actually is.
Yeah. You can make something work, as you say.
Yeah.
You can bend it, you can shape it. But understanding what's been done, and if you're having to do an as-is migration, doing exactly the same thing, you've got to spend a lot of time up front understanding those designs and recreating those designs so that someone new can pick them up that doesn't necessarily have BizTalk knowledge. So that's probably the key thing.
I think one of the other key things that I'd say, so key takeaway number 2 really for me, and that is that it's just how much of it you can reuse now.
Yeah.
That there is no other migration path that gives you that much reuse of schemas and maps. Upcoming is the business rules engine, but then the C# code that you've got in pipeline components, and also C# code that you call out to in orchestrations.
Yeah.
All those things can be reused.
Yeah.
And so nothing else gives you that amount of reuse.
Yeah.
So then that's a key thing.
Yeah.
Any other ones that you think of?
So in terms of the assets, you've mentioned the maps and so on, but like I mentioned, the platform is always evolving as well. So the key thing is do what you need to do with the platform as it is at the moment, but take into account you might want to create some technical debt that you can re-implement in the future. So that's one of the key takeaways, that the platform's always evolving, so you're always going to be able to do something better in the future.
And just be at ease with that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And finally, the other thing is that BizTalk license model is per year per
Per
CPU core,
virtual CPU core. Yeah.
for virtual CPU core. So if you've got, particularly for larger BizTalk groups and for when you've got multiple groups, I mean the license costs can be significant. And then if you look at, like say, a 5-year lifespan for that, you look at the cost of it, it can be significant. And then you can, and that actually running in Azure can be really comparatively very cheap. It can be an order of magnitude less cost.
Yeah.
So you can be going from 6 or 7 figures a year down to 5 figures a year. There are really big cost savings available. So
I think, to put it into perspective, the production environment that had the 4 or 5 BizTalk groups, I think there's 38 virtual CPUs.
Yeah.
So how much is it? And obviously each customer is charged differently for a BizTalk license.
Depends on volume.
Depending on volume, yeah. But if you said, for example, the base cost was 40 grand for a BizTalk license, which is often the figure quoted, 44 is quite a lot of money, isn't it?
It's a lot of license costs.
Yeah.
So you don't, and I mean, we often talk about, quite a high spec Azure implementation being, 30 to 50,000 a year, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Obviously it depends on, just how heavily it's used.
Yeah.
But you're talking orders of magnitude difference in terms of the cost sometimes. So that's a massive.
It's also that ability to scale up and down as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that peaks and troughs as new business workloads come up, different times of the year for different types of customers and so on. So you can more easily take that into account. So
because one of the ones, because a big BizTalk solution we worked on for a bank was sized so that on the first of the month, when everyone had their direct debits, you could process tens of millions of these in an overnight window. And so the whole BizTalk thing was sized for that. And then the rest of the time, it was running at like 1%.
Yeah.
And yet in the cloud, you can use auto scale, and on that peak, it'll go, I'll run 100 instances for 6 hours, and then go back down to 3. And then you're only paying for what you use. So just that sort of elastic scale is just really powerful as well.
And the pricing options for logic apps and app service plans, they're changing as well. So some of the ways that we had to do it 2 years ago is now different. So there's cheaper options as well now available.
Yeah.
If you have an interface that only runs once a month or twice a month, you don't need
You don't need to be running it.
You don't need £150 a month app service plan. You can run it on something that is only going to charge you for a small percentage of that, really.
Yeah, and similarly, if you're using something like Turbo 360 and using the cost management module, then it can actually change the SKU of that in certain service windows as well. So there's all sorts of things you can do to make these solutions run more efficiently.
Yeah.
Right, I think that is I think that's everything we've got to cover.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for listening in today. That is how we migrated a large-scale BizTalk solution into Azure with David Robinson. I'm Andrew Rivers of 345 Technology. Thank you very much for listening in.
Thank you.